The 90s were full of cartoons that featured ensembles of talking, semi-human, half-animal things. I mean, after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, just about any combination of words could be mashed together and conceivably be a new kids' TV show. Which, I'm assuming, is the unofficial origin of a show that I loved as a kid, although it never got anywhere near the same recognition. And that is Biker Mice from Mars. And before anybody starts to try and claim that this show didn't take heavy inspiration from TMNT, we get this line 7 minutes into the first episode.
I don't believe this. I've just been saved by a bunch of giant gerbils?
Mice, ma'am. We're mice.
Mice?
You were expecting turtles, maybe?
Then, in the Christmas episode of the first season, the character Throttle even tries to talk a kid out of wanting waterlogged reptile toys.
Oh no, man, you don't really want toys that look like some waterlogged reptiles, do you?
Which, to be fair, my transforming Michelangelo did go rusty from the amount of time playing with him around water. But then, of course, there's this.
Oh, I hate to say it, bros, but cowabunga!
Cowa what?
Where'd he pick that up?
And this.
A lot less annoying.
Cowabunga.
No, too unbelievable.
They don't even try to hide it. I mean, as well as not liking turtles, they particularly don't like rats, because they turned against them during the war. I can't work out if that's a knock on Splinter, but some of the monsters do look a bit familiar. Even a lot of the enemy machinery looks like they're rip-offs of TMNT IPs, like the mining machines that look like giant versions of Baxter Stockman's Mausers, not to mention they're going after mice. At one point they even take a dig at the other TMNT-inspired show, Street Sharks.
Land sharks away.
We're not talking about mutants here though. In this universe, the planet Mars was the home of a race of humanoid mice, but their planet was taken over by aliens and the majority were killed. Of the 3 that survived, 2 of them, Moto and Vinny, still bear the scars of their final battle. The 3 fled their home but were forced to crash land on Earth in Chicago. Obviously it had to be Chicago, not New York. But it turns out that these Plutarchian miners are here on Earth too. In order to get back on the road, so to speak, they'll need to fix their bikes and their spaceship. That also flies like a bike. In the meantime, they create a hideout in the scoreboard of the local baseball team in which they crashed. Or was it the football field? After all, it's meant to be Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs, or in this case, the Chicago Nubs. And the scoreboard is definitely for baseball, but then a few episodes later, even referring to it as Quigley Field, it's now a football stadium for the Chicago Grizzlies, a play on the Chicago Bears. And now it's a football scoreboard. Although, later on, it's back to being a baseball scoreboard. So I guess in this show it's meant to be like the pre-1970s setup in Chicago where the teams shared the stadium. Or something. I don't know anything about American sports. Not that that seems to matter anyway, because at one point in the rebooted series it turns into a soccer stadium, so who knows. To fix their bikes they go to the last garage in town and befriend a mechanic named April. I mean, Charlie. Should be easy enough to remember, as her surname is actually Davidson. So yes, Charlie Davidson. See what they did there? Obviously their bikes aren't just your average Harleys. They're powered up with weapons and gadgets to take down Limburger and the rest of the Earth-based Plutarchian goons. They're also possibly sentient, but I never quite figured that one out. In the absence of superpowers, it's the bikes that are the main means of fighting the bad guys. They're constantly being upgraded with different weapons or armour for the current fight, even being combined every now and then. So I guess you could say that this show also took a little bit of inspiration from Power Rangers too. It never really gets explained who the goons Grease Pit and Carbuncle are and why they work for Limburger, because they're not actually Plutarchian, they're human. And then there's also this Frankenstein Igor-type monster called Fred, who is, well, basically, he's a sadist. His main motivation is wanting to experience pain, which he finds intensely pleasurable.
Come to Papa, you little Catch me if you can! Please, studded tires next time!
Which, when you think about it, is probably not a good trait to have in a minion.
Nice and solid. Oh, do me too! Please, please!
Appropriately or not, as a show about mutant or Martian mice, there are a hell of a lot of cheese references. Although it's stated that the mice don't actually like cheese, which may be a reference to the fact that the turtles love pizza so much, and so as a counterbalance, they made the biker mice more into hot dogs and root beer. I don't really know why, but what I do know is that most of the villains in the show are named after different types of cheese, which actually makes complete sense because you see the Plutarchians are portrayed as fish-like creatures. So they're cheese fish. To be fair, I use the name Pomelo fish, so I can't really complain. I suppose one connection is that one of their key characteristics is that they smell. I haven't worked out whether that's smelling of fish or of cheese, but either way, with a quick roll call, there's Limburger, often referred to as the Big Cheese, Napoleon Brie, Lord Camembert, and then there's Mudfish Murdoch, Provolone, Dominic T. Stilton, Gerard Gruyere, Jack Monterey, Guta Maguda, Romana Parmesana, and it just goes on and on. Although most of the latter don't appear until season 3. However, let's not forget my personal favourites, Gorgonzola and Monsterella. But you see, this is the subtle genius of it all. They're all named after cheese because it's never explained why they're named after cheese. At one point in season 2, Limburger even buys an amusement park as his new headquarters, and to hide his operations behind a seemingly legitimate business, he creates Cheesyland, a cheese-themed theme park which hides his mining activities underneath it. Fish, cheese, stink. I'm going to be optimistic and assume it's not a reference to genitalia. But at this point, we have a fish-based, cheese-obsessed alien, although he doesn't eat cheese, he eats worms, who's mining Chicago because they'd already finished mining Mars, the home of the last 3 remaining giant motorbike-riding humanoid mice, who are now effectively extinct because there's no female of the species. Welcome to 90s cartoons. Amazingly, despite it taking place in Chicago, having so many cheese references, and taking so much inspiration from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Chicago-style pizza isn't mentioned once. And it shouldn't be, because it's not pizza. What is it, John?
It's a cornbread biscuit which you've melted cheese on, and then, in defiance of God and man and all things holy, you poured uncooked marinara sauce atop the cheese. Atop! The cheese on top, the sauce, naked, cold, on display like some sort of sauce hooer.
Exactly that. And while Limburger is mining Chicago, he has a rival in Detroit, Napoleon Brie, doing the same thing. Which is an interesting idea, to introduce another Plutarchian as an antagonist, but not actually an ally of Limburger. But then the biker mice just go back to Chicago and leave Napoleon to do whatever he needs to do in Detroit. It's only when Brie and Limburger cross paths that the biker mice get roped in as well. So effectively, they just ignore an arguably more efficient Plutarchian miner on Earth. It'd be like in Power Rangers if Rita had a rival that attacked London instead of Angel Grove and they were just like, not my jurisdiction. You think they'd at least split their forces between the two cities, but no. They just go back to their new and supposedly temporary home. Which gets even worse when you realise there's Plutarchian leaders hidden in loads of major US cities, but as long as they stay out of Chicago, they won't be hassled. Which doesn't make these guys very good heroes, does it? Limburger adopts the Monster of the Week approach, like Power Rangers, which is needed because the show goes from 13 episodes in season 1 to nearly 40 in season 2. He gets his mad scientist sidekick to teleport himself a monster, some of which are a little familiar, like for example the Exterminator.
Hasta la vista, rodents.
Bearing in mind that Terminator 2 had just come out a couple of years ago, as I discuss in my top 20 movie motorcycles over on Totally Motors. Cheap plug maybe, but I am doing a video about biker mice, so consider this a crossover. Charlie actually does become a biker as well, but is not part of the full-time crime-fighting lineup. It's only for one episode. But she does still accompany them on a lot of missions. She's not just a mechanic or a friend, she gets her hands dirty too. She does also have her own bike, but not the bike she uses when she briefly becomes the fourth member of the team. But it turns out that there were actually plenty of other survivors of the Plutarchian War on Mars. While there are other Martian species still on Mars, there is also a gang of freedom fighter mice led by General Carbine, a former love interest of Throttle. Meanwhile, Vinny also has a love interest in Season 2, Charlie. Yep, that happens. At least April never slept with any of the turtles, but you know what? I'm not going to judge. Those mice are ripped, so have your fun. Carbine doesn't make too many appearances in the show though, as she's stuck on Mars, and there's some explanation about there being no more Martian spaceships. So while she's sort of Throttle's girlfriend, it's a long-distance relationship kind of thing. The biker mice do want to go back to Mars, and maybe even take Charlie with them, but they need to deal with the Earth-based Plutarchians first. Or maybe just Limburger, I'm not sure they can be bothered with the others. But then, about halfway through Season 2, Modo's nephew, Rimfire, steals a Plutarchian ship, as he's captured by slavers and sold for hunting sport to some other aliens. Which is a little heavy for a kid's cartoon, don't you think? Although, to be fair, slavery is also the theme in the reboot as well. I'm assuming the rating for this show were a little up and down, because there's a surprising number of clip shows that recap what's happened previously. It's like they needed to remind the audience constantly of the story that had already happened. Also, towards the end of Season 2, the animation style completely changes for a couple of episodes. It looks cheaper, some of the characters look different, and there's far fewer frames of animation. It's really jarring. It's like it's been done as an anime, but not particularly well. As time goes on, the biker mice seem to abandon the idea of living in the Quigley Field scoreboard and spend all their time at the garage. Also, the concept of fixing their spaceship sort of goes out the window too, and it seems like it gets scrapped for some armour at some point as well. The show eventually ends with a look back at the Plutarchian War on Mars and how we got to episode 1 of Season 1, but then it just ends. We don't see what happens to Limburger, we don't see what happens to Plutarch, although it might be destroyed off camera. We don't know if the mice ever make it back to Mars, we don't know whether Vinny and Charlie ever really get together. It's just over. And it's sad because the last few episodes, where they recap what happened on Mars, are actually really interesting. It starts to build a proper lore, but it never gets resolved. However, obviously, being a Marvel title, there was also a comic book that accompanied the show, although it didn't really last very long. And of course, there were also the video games and many, many toys. After all, these types of cartoons tended to make their money on the merchandising and the licensing rather than the show itself. But again, none of these end the story. As far as I can tell, there was only 3 issues of the comic book ever made. They're essentially just retellings of the first few episodes, up to and including the battle with the Exterminator. Although apparently the first issue came out before the TV show, oddly enough. There was a 4th issue planned, but it was cancelled. I can only assume because the sales figures weren't very high, but I can't find any information on it. Either way, it probably wouldn't have added much more than the TV show did. Interestingly though, after I'd finished the script for this video, I walked into a forbidden planet, only to find there's a whole new comic series. This is completely different though, set in 2091, but it's still set on a lush green Mars. It wasn't until 2006, 10 years later, that we got a reboot of the show. Except it wasn't a reboot. It was meant to be a continuation of the original run. But unfortunately, it doesn't shed any light on what happened, at least not to begin with anyway. In this version, the Plutarchians are nowhere to be found. This time around, the biker mice are fighting the Catatonians. Not the ones you're thinking of.
It's You give me road rage.
These are a species of cat-like creatures, which actually makes more sense against mice. Why was it fish? Never mind cheesy fish. And it puts more focus on the difficult-to-trust founder of the freedom fighters, Stoker. The 4 mice head to Earth, as apparently that's the only place Stoker can rebuild a generator needed to make water for Mars. Limburger is also gone, and the main villain on Earth is now a devious millionaire businessman with a massive comb-over, who works in real estate, lives in a giant gilded tower, and cheats at golf. His name, no way to ease into this, is Ronaldo Rump. And if you're thinking any of that sounds familiar, you'd be right. Ronaldo Rump is a parody of Donald Trump. The main villain in the 2006 Biker Mice from Mars is an Hispanic version of Donald Trump that laughs like Ricky Ricardo.
Oh, Flair, my friend, lest I forget to tell you, you're fired. That's a good one.
I could probably say a lot about that, but I'm not going to, as I can only imagine what the comments section would look like. We do, however, see Limburger again, and Carbuncle too. Supposedly the Plutarchians abandoned their mining operations on Earth, but Camembert cast Limburger out, so he spent years in servitude of the Pit Boss, an underground antagonist from the original series. Eventually, bearing in mind we've been waiting a decade for this, we finally learn what happened at the end of the original series and how it ties into this one. Stoker had originally crash-landed on Earth, and Rump stole his regenerator and started developing his real estate empire with it. Yes, he built a real estate empire of questionable origin. Moving on. Meanwhile, Limburger's final plan failed, and all the Plutarchians were removed from Earth and sent back to Plutarch, except for Limburger, of course, who was then marooned. The Biker Mice then bid farewell to Charlie and headed back to Mars. The Catatonians had helped rid the Earth of Plutarchians, cat, fish, okay, and then made a deal with Rump to try and get their hands on the regenerator technology. So Rump was making shady deals with enemies of the people. And people thought that the Simpsons were prophetic. But Limburger teams up with Napoleon Brie, which immediately backfires, with both of them being degenerated back to actual fish. I suppose it works like the de-evolution thing in the Super Mario Bros. Movie. And it all ends in one final battle. This time around though, Charlie heads back to Mars with the mice, and Carbine and Throttle finally get together. The 2006 season is quite different to the original. For the most part it just does its own thing, but it does a good job of carrying on from the original show a decade later. I mean, it helps that much of the original voice cast returned as well to reprise their roles, including the main Biker Mice and Limburger. And the show certainly didn't lack for talent. Some of the featured voices included Mark Hamill, Leah Remini, Malcolm McDowell, and some other voice acting veterans too. Not to mention, we do need to go back to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as the voice of Throttle, Rob Paulson, voiced Raphael in the original series and then Donatello in the 2012 series. The voice of Modo, Dorian Harewood, occasionally voiced Shredder, and then the voice of Grease Pit, Brad Garrett, voiced Krang in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows. I do wonder if the intention was to imply that this was actually meant to be the same universe as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, they were never owned by the same company, so officially they're not, but it does feel like it's the implication. But then there's things that are also just mirrors of TMNT, like in episode 2 where Limburger attempts to frame the mice by dressing Grease Pit and others up and committing crimes in plain sight, much like in TMNT with the Crooked Turtle Gang. And there are more tongue-in-cheek references to other kids shows like Superman. Oh, and when they need to prevent a nuclear meltdown, they read up on how to do that in a book written by Montgomery Burns.
Excellent.
I do sometimes think back to Biker Mice from Mars as a show that never really got the recognition it deserved. I mean, yes, it was weird, but most 90s cartoons are weird. It feels like the show was born around the name, like TMNT was. You just come up with something quirky sounding like Biker Mice from Mars, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, The Adventures of Giggle Squid, cheap plug, and then build a lore around it. I have to say though, I don't really know why it had to be Mars. At least not this Mars. I mean, not only are there multiple different species living there, but the planet is also shown as being previously vibrant with flowing water and plants. It's also shown to have similar atmosphere and gravity to Earth, even though they earlier show the moon as having lower gravity. But apparently it also has its own large moons. Now, if this was some fictitious planet, then all of this would be fine, but Mars? Why would you make a notoriously bland planet so biodiverse? I feel like they had the name, Biker Mice from Mars, and just fell in love with it, so they didn't want to change it to Biker Mice from Flugsia, because somehow that would be less weird that way. In the 2006 version of the show, Throttle talks about Mars going through global warming, but then it's Stoker's regenerator that brings it back to life. But then that's what attracted the Plutarchians, which, again, that's all fine, but make it a far-off galaxy or another universe, not our Mars. Maybe someone had seen Total Recall and just ran with it a bit too far. Even the new comics seem to be set on just Mars. Granted, it's in the future, but it's still Mars, and it's only like 70 odd years. All you need to do is do the Marvel thing and make it Mars 29861 or something. Just make it a different universe. There are a few other questionable things as well, like the mice always obey the law. Now, of course, that's a good message, but they take it to odd extremes. Like when Greasepit is made police chief for an episode and they get arrested, they help Charlie get away but don't escape themselves because, technically, at least for that episode, he's the law. Or, when they're in a chase and the lights turn red, they stop chasing. Presumably they have more of a liberal attitude towards speeding, but still. Thankfully, at no point does Throttle stop the action to say, you know what boys, it's 25 miles an hour, okay? And then there's the episode where Limburger manages to get a legal order to condemn part of the city. They agree that they can't stop him because he got a legal order. So it's the law. I mean, they still find a way around it, but still, in principle, they're prepared to let it happen. Criticisms aside though, it still amazes me that animated shows like this were ever made. Imagine the work that goes into creating enough episodes to cover one per week, every week for a year, and then doing it all over again. I mean, there's thousands of hand-painted animation cells required just to make one episode. I actually have some of the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cells here. They sold them off eventually for relatively cheap because, honestly, how would they store the hundreds of thousands of them that they had? And it blows my mind that there were whole teams of people sat at desks drawing and painting these, with up to 24 needed for a single frame of footage. I still have a soft spot for Biker Mice from Mars, but apparently so did Ryan Reynolds, as here we are in 2024, and apparently it's coming back. Will it be a complete reboot, or is it something new? Does it tie into the new comics? Well, in the hands of a biker that also embraces the weird sometimes, time will tell, but it's certainly promising. But that's the end of this video, so until next time, I'll see you later.